Behind every farm, winemaker, bottle, and grape lies an untold story. This is Behind the Bottle, a podcast by Cape Classics, a South African and French wine importer founded in 1992. We are committed to discovering and sharing these tales. I am May-Eliane Phillips, and in today's episode, we're chatting with Nicolas Bureau, export director of Glenelly and the grandson of proprietor May-Eliane de Lencquesaing. Glenelly is situated in Stellenbosch, South Africa, but its story began in France over 200 years ago. Hi, Nick. Thanks for joining us today. So you're a French family producing wine in South Africa. How did you end up there?
So my family on my grandmother's side is the May-Eliane family from the Médoc, from the left bank of Bordeaux. They started in the wine business in the late 18th century as wine brokers, one of the oldest family of wine brokers in the left bank of Bordeaux. Throughout the 19th century, they started buying estates, mainly in the Médoc, Château Siran in Margaux being the first one to be purchased in the family. And it culminated in the 1920s when my great-grandfather and his brother, that's Edouard and Louis May-Eliane, bought a string of chateaux at a time when really nobody wanted to own them. As you can imagine, in the 1920s, there was the big crisis here in the US, which spread out to Europe. So it was a real bet on the future that these two brothers bought these chateaux in the left bank of Bordeaux. One of them was Château Pichon-Longueville, Comtesse de la Lande in Pauillac, which my grandmother, May-Eliane de Lencquesaing, inherited in the late 70s. And she took over Pichon and really took it to the next level. And during her watch, Pichon-Lalande became known as a super second of Bordeaux. And in some vintages, making wines on par with the first growths, neighboring Château Latour, obviously, but also Lafite and Mouton, which are also in Pauillac. So my family has been in the wine business for over 200 years. I'm the 8th generation to be involved alongside my cousin. Now, more precisely about how did we end up in South Africa? Well, my grandmother always wanted to make wine outside of France. She explored ventures here in the US, also in other parts of the world, but it never really materialized. And in the middle of the 1990s, she sponsored a trophy at the International Wine and Spirit competition in London. It was called the Pichon-Lalande Trophy, and this trophy was awarded to the best red blended wine in the world every year. And every second year, this trophy was won by a South African producer. So some very famous names won the trophy, the likes of Kanonkop, obviously, Meerlust, Verkelegen, and others. So it really opened my grandmother's eyes to the potential of making premium wines in South Africa. So she started exploring the Cape, and she found Glenelly. Glenelly is in Stellenbosch. It was actually a fruit farm when my grandmother purchased it, but ideally located in Stellenbosch, right on the edge of town, and right next to another famous estate called Rustenburg Estate. And for her, it was like finding the ideal terroir, the ideal topography for planting vines, because we are on the lower slopes of a big mountain called the Simmonsberg Mountain, which towers above Stellenbosch, was about 1,500 meters. This was like almost like a dream come true, because it was like a blank canvas for her. And so she set about to plant the vineyard. So we started this project in 2003. My grandmother was then 78 years old. And there's not a lot of people who plant vineyards at the age of 78, as you can imagine, as it's a very, very long-term project. But so we planted 57 hectares of vineyard, with a big focus, obviously, on Bordeaux varietals, because that's where Stellenbosch is very good at. A little bit of Syrah as well, which does really well in this climate, and some Chardonnay. So that's just the background to how we arrived in Stellenbosch in 2003, in a very exciting time, I think, for the South African wine industry. where a lot of the vineyard has been replanted since the democracy came in the early 90s, and with a very exciting generation of young winemakers. So that's the story, really.
Can you describe the terroir in the Siemensberg and Ida Valley? What makes it unique when comparing it to the rest of Stellenbosch?
I mean, Stellenbosch is divided in sub-wards or sub-appellations, and Siemensberg-Stellenbosch is one of them. And as I was saying earlier, it's named after the Siemensberg mountain, which is the big mountain which towers above Stellenbosch. We are on the lower slopes of this mountain, which makes for very interesting exposures, to different exposures to the sun. We have at Glenelly one of the rare east-facing slopes in Stellenbosch, which means a much cooler slope because we get mainly the morning sun. And that's also, quite unique in Stellenbosch. In terms of terroir, we work on very old decomposed granitic soils, some of the oldest viticultural soils in the world, which, for instance, if we compare to Bordeaux or mainly the left bank where we're from, predates by several hundred millions of years in terms of geological structure. I think just bouncing on this, comparing Bordeaux and South Africa, historically, I think there's a very interesting fact that we all know that the first vintage in South Africa was proclaimed in 1659. When we look at Bordeaux, especially the left bank, in 1659, the very famous vineyards of the first growth and second growth of Bordeaux were not even planted in the Médoc. We know that the vineyards of Lafite, I think, were planted in the 1670s. So this just gives you also an idea of the history and how old the industry is in South Africa in comparisons with some regions of Bordeaux. Now, in terms of climate, so we have obviously different climate to Bordeaux. It's very Mediterranean style, with warm summers and mild winters. There's a comparison that can be made with Bordeaux in that we have very strong influence from the ocean. Bordeaux, as you know, is on the Atlantic Ocean. The Cape, or the Western Cape, is on the South Atlantic Ocean. There's a slight difference, is that the South Atlantic Ocean is a very cold ocean. This is what helps us keep our vineyards cool as we get a constant wind coming from the ocean, which really cools down our vineyards. So the oceanic influence in South Africa, or more specifically in Stellenbosch, is quite similar to the one that we find in Bordeaux. So lots of similarities and lots of differences as well, which is why we don't produce Bordeaux wines in Stellenbosch, and that's why the Stellenbosch wines have such a strong identity as well, which is different to Bordeaux.
And what style of wines do you end up producing?
First of all, we produce only still wines at Glenelly. We produce mainly red wines and a little bit of white wines from the Chardonnay varietal. So we're about 80% red versus 20% white. From the red varietals, we produce single varietal wines and blended wines. And in terms of style, we're definitely looking more towards Europe in terms of style rather than the New World. So what does that mean, really? Well, we're looking for making wines which have inherent balance in them. Balance between the alcohol, the sugars, the tannic structure, the fruit. And we try to keep everything in balance. So that's a real kind of signature of our wines. One thing that you will taste when you taste our wines is that we avoid at all costs any overripe notes or any jammy notes in our wines, which can really show in the warm climate like we have in South Africa. So how do we do that? The main factor is by picking the grapes as soon as we have phenolic ripeness. So that's ripeness of the skins and the pips. And we don't let the grapes hang for any longer than necessary. So by doing that, we avoid these jammy notes, which you can very easily have in South Africa with the warm climate we have. So we make wines which are obviously dry. We try and avoid any residual sugar or excess residual sugar in our wines. We're looking for structure, tannic structure. We like freshness. We like acidity in our wines. And generally, it makes for wines which have great ageability and also which are very food friendly. Coming from France, obviously, we have a tradition of drinking wine with food rather than on its own. And in order for these wines to pair with food, we truly believe that these wines should not be overwhelming or should not overpower the food they are matched with or paired with. So a very classic approach to winemaking and to what our wines are destined for. So matching with food, and for some of our wines, cellaring does them a lot of good. And we can see now, tasting our first vintages, 2008, 2009, these are wines which are just starting to drink very nicely. If you are patient enough and if you have a little cellar, if you can put a few bottles away, just like you would for a good Bordeaux or a good Burgundy, well, you will be rewarded, really.
So when your grandmother decided to move to South Africa, which is a really impressive undertaking at that age, she had to build the winery as well, correct?
Absolutely. So Glenelly was a blank canvas. It was a fruit farm when we bought it. So not a single vineyard and obviously no winery. So everything had to be done from scratch. My grandmother, being how she is very modern, went for a very, very modern winery. Probably one of the most modern wineries in South Africa, I would say, which is built inside the mountain, and it works on the gravity flow system. So what does that mean? We work on 4 different levels. The top floor is the tank room. Then we have 2 levels of barrel room below. And right at the bottom, we have our bottling line and our storage. Everything works on the gravity flow principle, which means the tank fill the barrels and the barrels then fill the bottling chain. So it's a very soft process on the wine. It means we do not pump the wine at all. So that's one very interesting aspect of the winery. But the other one is that we inaugurated this building in 2008, and since we've never brought any yeasts into the cellar, any industrial yeast, that's to say. So which means that we only work with the indigenous yeasts that are present on the farm. All of our fermentations are spontaneous fermentations. And again, that's quite a rare thing in South Africa. Not a lot of people work like that. In terms of water management, we work on a very, almost on a closed circuit. As you all know, you've probably heard, we have lots of issues with water in South Africa. There's been a big drought recently. For the past 3 or 4 years, water has really been an issue. So we work on a very closed circuit, in that we recycle all of the water that we use in the winery, and then it's basically then used for the irrigation of the vines, and then obviously we pump it again through the borehole. So it's almost like a closed circuit with a lot of recycling going on. One final aspect which is interesting is that we have solar panels on the rooftop of the winery, which accounts for about 50% of our energy needs. So again, I think a very modern building with modern technology, but obviously inside the building we'll use very traditional methods that are, almost ancestral methods. Obviously, we use barrels, mainly French oak actually, and we try to intervene as little as possible in the process of winemaking as we can. Our winemaker, Luca Quinnigan, is a very talented winemaker who has traveled a lot, worked in France, worked in Bordeaux, at Château Angelus, among others, also worked in the United States at Screaming Eagle. The little he can do in the winemaking process, the happier he is, really. As really our philosophy is to make wines which are a very good example of the vintage and obviously a good example of the varietal or the blend we're trying to make. So minimal intervention is really what we're trying to do in the winery.
So Nick, you've spent a good amount of time in the U.S. market over the years, touching both consumers and tastings and events, and also on the trade side. How do you find the wines have been received?
Although we've only started selling our wines in the US with Cape Classics, I think 8 or 9 years ago, we have a very long history with the US market. Obviously, my grandmother, when she was running Pichon Lalande, the US market, right away when she started from the late 70s, early 80s, was a very big market for her. It really coincided also with the first reviews from Robert Parker in the early 80s. And it really, the US market has always been a very big draw for the wines of Pichon Lalande. So when we arrived 10 years ago selling our wines, our South African wines, Glenelly wines in the US, we benefited a lot from this almost aura that my grandmother had with her wines from Bordeaux. So it was a great help to get us started on the US market. Now, you can't sell wine just on the back of reputation from another vineyard. So obviously the wine had to
stand on its own.
Exactly, stand on its own. And I think the wines have been very well received. And I think if people taste our wines blind, especially the Lady May, which is our flagship wine, and it's a Bordeaux blend, they taste it blind against the wines of Pichon, for instance. And this is an exercise we try and do as often as we can. I think a lot of people will see similarities or similar qualities to Lady May and Pichon Lalande. And I think it's a real draw for both the consumer and for obviously the trade, because you are getting a wine that's been made by the same person in 2 different continents. And I think South African wine in general, as you can imagine, price-wise is much more attractive than Bordeaux, especially these days when we see the price of these super seconds or even third, fourth growth really going through the roof. The US market has been great for us. It's our second biggest export market, so it's a very big focus for us. I'm very optimistic for the future of our wines in the US, but also for South African wines. I think they've yet to be in the limelight, and I think these days are hopefully coming as the consumer recognizes the quality of the wines that are produced there and also the amazing value that they offer.
Now, I heard you're moving to South Africa at the end of the year with your wife and 3 young daughters. What do you love about South Africa, as that's a big move for you guys?
So when I first came to South Africa in 1998, it was my grandmother taking us grandchildren. So there's 10 of us, but I think 6 of us went on that trip. That's something my grandmother did a lot. A few years ago, she would take all of her grandchildren to different countries of the world. And one of these trips was South Africa. I immediately fell in love with South Africa the first day I got there. Obviously, back then, there was no question of Glenelly or making wine in South Africa, because this came almost 6 years later. But I've always found, South Africa to be a very special country. Obviously, it has a long and tortuous history, but it's really a country that you really fall in love with. And I've been going ever since every year to South Africa several times, mainly professionally, and I'm really looking forward to moving there with my family to hopefully discover other places than the winelands, because there's obviously a lot more to South Africa than just the winelands. I think it's a very big country with lots to do and to explore. So yes, moving there at the end of the year and very excited about it.
A new adventure.
Exactly.
This This episode of Behind the Bottle was recorded and produced in our offices in New York City. You can purchase any of the wines discussed today online at wine.com. For 10% off of your order, enter Cape Classics at checkout. For more information on Cape Classics wines, please visit capeclassics.com and follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Cape Classics Wines. Thank you for listening, and please tune in next time. Until then, cheers!